It was supposed to be just another day at the service. The crowd was buzzing, music filling the hall, people cheering, clapping, and lifting their hands in anticipation. Kenneth Copeland, a figure known worldwide for his sermons and spiritual guidance, stood at the center of the stage, radiating energy and confidence. He had always seemed untouchable, a man of immense presence, commanding attention with every word. But then, something unexpected happened. Without warning, Kenneth stumbled. A hush fell over the room. At first, people thought it was part of the show, a dramatic gesture, perhaps a prelude to an inspiring story. But then he collapsed, completely. The applause died instantly. A wave of shock rippled through the audience. Eyes widened, phones were raised, but no one dared to move too quickly. Some froze in disbelief, others rushed forward, unsure what to do. Panic spread quietly but quickly. Medical staff ran toward the stage. The crowd held its collective breath. People whispered prayers, calling on God to intervene, hoping for a miracle. The energy in the room shifted, from excitement to fear, from celebration to desperation. It was as if time itself had stopped, and then, in the middle of that chaos, a calm presence emerged. Jonathan Roumie stepped forward, moving with quiet confidence. Unlike everyone else, there was no panic in his steps, no frantic energy, no waving hands or loud calls. Just focus, just calm, just faith. He approached Kenneth with care, laying hands gently upon him. The room seemed to hold its breath again, this time in a mix of curiosity and awe. People began to whisper, "Who is that? Can he really help? What's he doing?" But Jonathan didn't answer. He simply prayed, softly, with an intensity that was almost tangible. The world around him seemed to slow down, and in that stillness, something began to change. No one knew what would happen next. Would Kenneth regain consciousness? Would the service end in tragedy? Or was this a moment that would transform everyone present in ways they couldn't yet imagine? One thing was certain. The room, the people, and even Kenneth Copeland himself were about to experience a moment that none of them would ever forget. A moment that would challenge everything they thought they knew about faith, resilience, and the unexpected power of humility. The room was alive with anticipation. Grand chandeliers cast a warm glow over hundreds of faces, all turned toward the stage. Some were sitting quietly, notebooks in hand, ready to absorb every word. Others were standing, arms raised, voices lifted in song, their hearts pounding with energy. This was not just any service. It was a moment people had been waiting for, all week, some for months. And at the center of it all stood Kenneth Copeland, a man whose presence alone could command attention, whose reputation preceded him, and whose sermons had inspired millions across the globe. Kenneth had always been larger than life. From the first moment he appeared on stage, there was a magnetic pull, a confidence that bordered on unshakable. He spoke with authority, gesturing broadly, moving across the platform with the ease of someone who knew every eye was on him. His words were fiery, his tone commanding, and his energy contagious. People leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every sentence. Some cheered, some nodded in deep agreement. It was a performance, a sermon, a spectacle, all at once. And then, without warning, everything changed. It started as a subtle stumble. Kenneth shifted his weight, then faltered. For a second, no one reacted. Some thought it was dramatic emphasis, part of the sermon, a purposeful pause before a powerful line. But the second it became clear that he wasn't just moving theatrically, the entire room's energy shifted. A wave of confusion swept through the audience. Eyes widened, murmurs began, low at first, then louder as people realized what was happening. Kenneth's knees buckled, and in an instant, he collapsed. The sound of his body hitting the stage was shocking, in its finality. Silence fell like a heavy blanket over the room. The choir stopped mid. Note, hands froze mid-clap. Phones hovered in the air, recording the scene. But even the act of filming felt inadequate. The gravity of the moment made technology feel irrelevant. Fear replaced excitement. Desperation replaced awe. Medical staff rushed forward, weaving through the crowd with calm urgency. Volunteers and assistants scrambled to create space, trying to maintain order while keeping an eye on the fallen pastor. Some people began to cry quietly. Others whispered prayers, some aloud, some under their breath. God, please, Lord, intervene. Don't let this be the end. The collective energy of hundreds of hearts seemed to pulse, frantic and desperate, amid the chaos. One figure moved differently. Jonathan Roumie stepped forward. Unlike the others, there was no panic in his eyes, no frantic energy in his hands. He did not push through the crowd. He did not shout over the noise. He walked with calm determination. Each step measured, purposeful. People parted instinctively as he approached Kenneth, sensing something unusual, something powerful. In his presence, Jonathan knelt beside Kenneth, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. The touch was soft but deliberate. A hush fell over the room once more, not from fear but from a sudden, unexplainable awe. Everyone watching felt it, a shift in energy, a quiet authority that demanded attention without demanding noise. The chaos of the room seemed to shrink into stillness around him. Sometimes, Jonathan whispered, almost to himself, the power we need isn't in force, it's in faith. No one moved for a moment. Even the medical team paused, unsure if they should intervene further. But there was something about Jonathan's calmness that made people wait, made them hope, made them believe. It was as if the air itself had changed, thick with anticipation, thick with expectation, thick with the possibility of a miracle. As Jonathan continued to pray, softly, with hands still gently resting on Kenneth, the people around him felt the tension ease slightly. The fear in the room did not vanish, but it began to mix with hope. Some whispered to their neighbors. Some knelt where they were. Some recorded the moment, shaking hands, holding their phones, unsure if they were witnessing a miracle or simply a strange calm in the eye of a storm. Kenneth's body remained still, but his face was relaxed under Jonathan's touch, and that subtle change, the easing of tension in his features, was enough to stir something in everyone present. People began to lean in, straining to see, to feel, to understand. And, in that setup, in that suspended moment, the story was no longer just about Kenneth Copeland collapsing. It was about faith meeting action, about calm meeting chaos, about humility, presence, and quiet power stepping into a situation that had seemed hopeless. This was not just the prelude to a recovery. It was the beginning of a transformation that would not only affect Kenneth Copeland, but everyone watching, and anyone who would hear about it afterward. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Every eye was fixed on Kenneth Copeland, lying motionless on the stage. His chest rose and fell faintly, but his usual energy, the commanding presence that had inspired millions, was gone. The room, once filled with music, laughter, and applause, now trembled on the edge of fear. Murmurs grew louder, whispers spreading like wildfire. Is he going to be okay? Call the doctor. Samani, do something. Medical staff hovered close, their faces masks of professional concern. They prepared to administer emergency care, ready for any sudden deterioration. Yet, amidst all the urgency, Jonathan Roumie remained calm. He knelt beside Kenneth, hands resting gently on his chest and shoulder. There was no shouting, no frantic movements, just focus, just presence, just faith. Some volunteers approached, hesitating. Sir, we need to move him, one said nervously. Jonathan shook his head gently. Not yet, he replied softly. Let's give him a moment. A ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd. People whispered to each other. Who is that? Why isn't he panicking? Does he know something we don't? Jonathan's eyes were closed, his lips moving in quiet prayer. But this wasn't ordinary prayer. There was intensity, an almost electric concentration in the room that seemed to respond to him. Even the frantic energy of the onlookers began to settle, as if the chaos itself were being held at bay. Minutes felt like hours. Kenneth's body remained still, his face pale, his usual vitality absent. Some began to murmur doubts aloud. Maybe it's too late. I think he might not wake up. Anxiety rippled through the audience. Parents clutched their children. Elderly attendees gripped the pews. Phones continued to record, though some were lowered, as people realized that no technology could truly capture this moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, Kenneth twitched. A finger, a slight movement of his hand. Eyes widened. A nurse gasped. Jonathan's hands moved slightly, encouraging, steady, but still calm. "Faith before sight," he whispered, almost inaudibly. But those near enough to hear felt the weight of the words. The tension skyrocketed. Every second that passed seemed monumental. Kenneth's chest rose more visibly now. His eyelids fluttered. The audience leaned in instinctively, holding their breath collectively, afraid to blink, as though the slightest distraction could undo the miracle unfolding. Some people in the crowd began to pray louder, inspired by Jonathan's presence. Others cried softly, overwhelmed by hope and fear simultaneously. "Lord, bring him back," whispered one attendee. A woman nearby clutched a Bible tightly to her chest, tears streaming down her face. The air was alive with energy, but not the ordinary excitement of a service. This was raw emotion, charged with the tension between life and uncertainty. Jonathan continued, unshaken. He murmured specific words of encouragement to Kenneth, words that seemed to guide more than just the physical body, words that penetrated the mind and soul. "You are stronger than you know. Awake now, awake and rise." Then came the pivotal moment. Kenneth's eyes slowly opened. Confusion, first, disbelief, second, and finally recognition. He looked at Jonathan, the calm, quiet figure who had refused to yield to panic, and something shifted in him. The fear, the pain, the uncertainty. It began to dissolve. He sat up slowly, supported by Jonathan's steady hands, and took in the room. Faces blurred with relief and awe. Applause erupted, tentative at first, then building into a crescendo as the reality sank in. Some people wept openly. Others shouted in joy, unable to contain themselves. Kenneth's recovery was more than physical. It was spiritual, emotional, and profound. What had started as panic had transformed into collective hope and awe. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, and yet, in the middle of it all, Jonathan remained calm, silent but powerful, the center of the storm. Kenneth struggled to his feet, steadied by Jonathan. I don't know what to say," he stammered, voice shaking. The crowd quieted, sensing the gravity of the moment. Jonathan smiled faintly. "You don't need to say anything, just believe. And now, move forward with faith." It was then that the audience began to understand the full magnitude of what they had witnessed. This wasn't simply a collapse and recovery. It was a lesson in presence, in calm under pressure, in the unspoken power of faith and humility. Kenneth Copeland, a man of incredible influence, had been brought to a vulnerable state, and in that vulnerability, he had been guided, steadied, and transformed. Even the medical staff seemed humbled. Phones were lowered. People knelt. Everyone present felt it, a moment that defied explanation, a moment that would be remembered forever. Jonathan stepped back, quietly allowing Kenneth to regain his balance, his life, and his composure. And in that step, in that calm retreat, the true lesson emerged. Sometimes, the most profound power is silent. Sometimes, the strongest force is unseen. And sometimes, the greatest change comes not from the expected hero, but from the quiet guide who refuses to panic when chaos reigns. The room was no longer the same. The music, once abruptly silenced by panic, had begun again, but it was softer, almost reverent. The clapping and cheers were tentative, as if people were still processing the gravity of what had just occurred. Kenneth Copeland, usually the center of every service, now stood a little more humbled, a little more reflective, his eyes scanning the crowd as though seeing them, and himself, for the first time. Whispers ran through the audience like electricity. "Did you see that?" someone asked, voice trembling. "He collapsed, and yet he's okay," another added. It wasn't just a recovery, it was something else, something spiritual. People pulled out their phones, replaying the few clips that had been captured, but even the recordings couldn't convey the weight of the moment. You had to be there to feel it, the silence, the fear, the hope, and then the release. Volunteers and staff began assisting Kenneth, helping him steady himself on the stage. Some smiled, others wiped tears from their eyes, and then all attention shifted naturally toward Jonathan Roumie. Where had he gone? No one had expected him to appear, and no one had realized the quiet force that had been guiding the moment. Yet now, it was impossible to ignore. People's gazes followed Jonathan as he stepped back, hands folded gently, eyes calm. For many, it was a revelation. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't waved his arms or demanded attention. He had simply acted with intention, presence, and faith. In a world accustomed to spectacle, that quiet authority was astonishing. Even some of the medical team nodded in silent respect, acknowledging the unspoken power they had witnessed. A few attendees approached Jonathan cautiously, some whispering thanks, others shaking with emotion. "I don't understand how you did that," one woman said softly. "It's like you were there before the miracle even happened." Jonathan only smiled faintly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Faith isn't about understanding, it's about believing. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is stay calm when the world is falling apart. Meanwhile, Kenneth Copeland's own reaction was evolving. He had always been a man of influence and authority, accustomed to commanding rooms and leading services with unwavering confidence. But this was different. This was a moment in which he had been powerless, in which he had been guided by someone else's faith and presence. It was humbling, grounding, and transformative all at once. He looked at Jonathan, and in that gaze was a mix of awe, gratitude, and understanding. An acknowledgement that greatness isn't only about commanding attention, but also about accepting guidance when it is needed most. The audience, sensing this shift, began to respond collectively. Some knelt, silently offering thanks. Others whispered prayers aloud, voices blending together in harmony. Some simply stood, overwhelmed by emotion, unsure of how to express the gratitude, relief, and inspiration that had flooded the room. The atmosphere was electric, but in a very different way than it had been before. Quieter, deeper, more profound. Even outside the immediate service, the ripple effect began. People shared stories on social media, describing what they had witnessed. Clips went viral, but viewers watching from home could sense, even through screens, that something extraordinary had occurred. People commented not on Kenneth's collapse, but on Jonathan's calm, his quiet authority, and the power of faith in action. Many reflected on their own lives, how often they panic under pressure, how often they underestimate quiet strength, how often they forget that presence can be more powerful than noise. Back in the room, Kenneth turned fully to Jonathan, voice still shaky but clear. I don't know how to thank you," he said. The audience hushed again. "You saved me, but not just my body, my spirit." Jonathan shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. The strength was always within you. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us to believe." For the rest of the service, the energy remained different. People clapped with intention, prayed with sincerity, and listened with awareness. Kenneth's words that day were different, too softer, more reflective, less commanding, more about connection and humility than authority. Even those sitting far away could feel the shift. Something had changed. By the time the service ended, the room was transformed. What had begun as panic and fear had become awe, reflection, and gratitude. People left quietly, talking in whispers, processing what they had just witnessed. For many, it was more than a miraculous recovery. It was a lesson in presence, faith, humility, and the quiet power of guiding others without demanding attention. The story of that day would be told for years to come, not just because Kenneth Copeland collapsed, but because Jonathan Roumie's calm faith, filled presence had changed everything. And somewhere in that transformation, the audience, Kenneth and Jonathan, all learned the same lesson. The loudest miracles are not always seen, but they are always felt. The room had settled into a quiet hum of reflection. The panic, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it had faded, leaving something far more profound behind. Kenneth Copeland, standing tall but clearly changed, looked out over the audience, taking in the faces of those who had witnessed his collapse and recovery. There was gratitude in their eyes, awe in their expressions, but there was something more, a deep understanding that this day had not just been about survival, but about transformation. Kenneth's gaze shifted to Jonathan Roumie, the calm presence, the quiet authority, the steady hands that had guided him in his most vulnerable moment. It was all clear now. He realized that the moment he had been powerless, when he had relied on someone else's faith, had opened his eyes to a truth he had perhaps never fully embraced. Influence and authority were not the same as humility and presence. Power alone could not protect him. It was the quiet, unwavering faith of another that had lifted him. He took a deep breath, steadying his voice. I want everyone here to understand something, he began. Voice strong yet tinged with humility. We often think that strength comes from what we command, from the power we hold, from the attention we receive. But real strength, real power, comes from being guided, from trusting, from allowing faith, whether divine or human, to carry us when we cannot carry ourselves. The audience leaned in, hanging on every word. Some whispered to their neighbors, "I've never heard him speak like this," while others nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of relief, awe, and inspiration. People were seeing not just Kenneth Copeland, the preacher, but Kenneth Copeland, the human, vulnerable, reflective, and transformed. He turned to Jonathan, extending his hand in genuine gratitude. "I don't know if words can ever express what you've done here," he said. "Not just for me, but for everyone in this room. You've shown us something far greater than a miracle. You've shown us the quiet power of faith, presence, and humility." Jonathan shook his head, smiling gently. The power was always there. You just had to see it in the moment. As the audience absorbed this exchange, something remarkable happened. People began to clap. But this was not the clapping of routine applause. It was deep, heartfelt, almost reverent. They clapped not only for Kenneth's recovery, but for the lesson the day had taught them, that moments of vulnerability could reveal the truest form of strength. Some cried openly, overcome by emotion. Others whispered prayers, inspired not only by the event, but by the transformation unfolding before them. Journalists and onlookers began recording again, but the story had shifted. It was no longer sensational headlines about a collapse. It was about a revelation, a lesson in faith, a display of human humility. Comments would flood social media. "It's not the powerful who inspire, it's the faithful. We need more calm in a world of chaos. Sometimes the strongest person is the one who guides quietly." Kenneth stepped forward again, voice steady, eyes shining. "From this day forward, I will preach not just with words, but with understanding. I will remember that humility is not weakness, and that sometimes the greatest leaders are those who allow themselves to be led." His reflection was met with nods, smiles, and tears. The room seemed to breathe collectively, as if everyone present had undergone their own personal transformation alongside him. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Jonathan," he said, his tone filled with warmth, "you have changed my life forever, and through this, I hope we can all learn that true leadership is not about control, but about faith, patience, and presence. It is about seeing the unseen, trusting the unseen, and acting with quiet strength when the world expects noise." Jonathan nodded, stepping back, letting Kenneth stand fully in the moment. The audience erupted into applause again, louder this time, but still reverent. Phones recorded, eyes glistened, hearts swelled. But the real impact was internal. People would leave that service forever changed, carrying a lesson far more enduring than the collapse or recovery itself. The lesson that transformation often comes through vulnerability, guidance, and faith. By the end of the service, Kenneth was not just recovered. He was renewed, and as he shook hands, shared smiles, and offered blessings, it was clear to everyone this day was not only about survival, it was about awakening, about understanding that power without humility is incomplete, that faith without action is unrealized, and that guidance, when offered with patience and presence, can transform lives in ways no one could predict. And, somewhere in the quiet, Jonathan Roumie stepped aside, unnoticed by many but respected by all, leaving a mark deeper than words, leaving a lesson louder than any sermon. The service slowly drew to a close, but the energy in the room was nothing like it had been at the start. The music played softly, almost contemplatively, as if even the instruments themselves recognized the weight of what had occurred. Kenneth Copeland stood at the front, no longer commanding the room with the forceful authority he often wielded, but speaking with calm, deliberate words that resonated deeply with every listener. He addressed the crowd, his voice steady, yet humbler than usual. "Today has taught me something I never expected to learn in such a dramatic way," he began. "We are all human. We are all vulnerable. And the truth is, no matter how much influence or power we hold, there are moments when we must allow ourselves to be guided, supported, and carried by the faith and wisdom of others." The audience listened intently, The usual distraction of phones and whispered conversations, gone. Even the staff, volunteers, and medical personnel who had rushed to his aid earlier were silent, absorbing the moment, feeling the weight of the lesson that had unfolded before them. What had started as panic, fear, and uncertainty had transformed into reflection, awe, and gratitude. Kenneth turned his gaze to Jonathan Roumie, who stood quietly at the side, his presence calm and unobtrusive. "Jonathan," Kenneth said, voice thick with emotion, "you didn't just help me recover. You've changed how I see myself, how I lead, and how I interact with the world. I was focused on authority, on power, on perception, but you reminded me that true strength lies in humility, patience, and faith." Jonathan smiled softly, stepping forward just a little. "You've always had the strength," he said. "Sometimes we just need someone to help us remember it." Today, it was about trust, presence, and believing in what we cannot see. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the applause began, tentative at first, then building into a crescendo of genuine, heartfelt appreciation. People cheered not just for Kenneth's physical recovery, but for the transformation they had witnessed. They cheered for the lesson that humility and faith can surpass authority and show true leadership. They cheered for the reminder that guidance often comes from unexpected places, and that those who remain calm under pressure hold the real power. As the applause died down, Kenneth continued, "I want everyone here to leave with this thought. Respect, patience, and faith are not just virtues for moments of comfort. They are tools for moments of crisis. Today, I experienced firsthand how someone's calm, their belief, their presence can save not only lives, but hearts and minds. We must all strive to carry that into our daily lives." Jonathan quietly moved back, letting Kenneth fully own the moment. But the impact of his intervention lingered in the air. In the hearts of everyone present, people began approaching him, some shaking his hand, some offering thanks, some simply standing in awe of what had occurred. Yet Jonathan's focus remained gentle, humble, the quiet guide, the unseen hand that had changed everything without claiming glory. Kenneth, meanwhile, began to reach out to his staff and congregation, showing gratitude for their support, acknowledging their concern, and admitting his vulnerability. "I was reminded today," he said, "that leadership isn't about never falling. It's about how we rise, how we allow guidance, and how we inspire through example, not just through words, but through action, humility, and faith." Volunteers and staff felt the shift immediately. Some exchanged looks, realizing that the lesson of the day applied to everyone, not just Kenneth. The way Jonathan had acted, with calm authority and unshakable faith, was a model that could be emulated in any situation. People began reflecting on their own lives, their own moments of panic, their own need for guidance, and what it truly meant to support others without seeking attention. By the end of the service, Kenneth Copeland's energy was different. It was still powerful, still inspiring, but it carried a new depth, a quiet humility that made every word land harder, every message resonate further. He had not just recovered from a collapse, he had awakened to a greater understanding of leadership, of faith, and of human connection. As the audience filed out, many stopped to offer thanks, nod in acknowledgement, or simply stand in reflection. The room, which had once been a place of spectacle, had transformed into a space of understanding, respect, and inspiration. And Jonathan Roumie, the quiet catalyst of the day, stepped aside, leaving everyone with the lasting impression that true power is not in being seen, but in guiding, supporting, and transforming lives quietly, yet profoundly. The story of that day would ripple far beyond the walls of the church. It would be shared, retold, and remembered, not as the day Kenneth Copeland collapsed, but as the day he was reminded what real faith, humility, and leadership truly meant. As the doors of the service closed and the last of the audience filtered out, a calm settled over the hall that was nothing like the energy of earlier moments. The excitement, fear, and chaos had given way to reflection, awe, and understanding. What had started as a sudden collapse, a moment of panic and vulnerability, had transformed into something far more profound. A lesson in humility, faith, and the quiet power of presence. Kenneth Copeland, standing, now with Jonathan Roumie beside him, took a deep breath and addressed the few who remained behind, those lingering to take in the weight of the day. "Today," he said, voice steady, but layered with emotion, "I learned something more important than any sermon I've ever preached. any speech I've ever given, or any audience I've ever commanded. I learned that respect, faith, and humility are the true pillars of leadership, and that they can transform lives in ways we never anticipate. He paused, letting the words settle. We live in a world where power is often measured by visibility, influence, and noise. We are told to command attention, to assert authority, to be the loudest in the room. But today, I was reminded that real power is silent. Real influence is gentle. Real leadership doesn't shout. It guides, it steadies, it uplifts. Jonathan Roumie nodded slightly, his quiet presence reinforcing the lesson Kenneth had just shared. It's easy to believe that only the strong survive, that only those who lead can change things. Jonathan said softly, but true strength is shown in the calm we carry, the faith we keep, and the guidance we offer to those who need it most. Sometimes, the smallest actions, the quietest presence, have the greatest impact. The lesson resonated not only with Kenneth, but with everyone who had witnessed the moment. The audience, volunteers, staff, and even the medical team had all experienced it. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in energy that could not be measured by applause or words alone. They had watched vulnerability meet calm guidance, panic meet unwavering faith, and fear meet quiet reassurance. The result was nothing short of transformative. Kenneth looked around the room, his eyes lingering on faces still reflecting awe. I want each of you to remember this, he said. Respect isn't something we give only when it's convenient, only when someone commands it, or only when it benefits us. Respect is a practice. It is shown to everyone, especially to those we might underestimate or take for granted, because one day the person we overlook, dismiss, or underestimate may be the one who changes everything for us. He smiled, a softer, warmer expression than usual. And remember this too, humility doesn't diminish you. Faith doesn't weaken you. Quiet strength doesn't go unnoticed. The world may reward noise and spectacle, but the lasting impact comes from patience, presence, and the courage to act with quiet confidence when it matters most. As the crowd began to disperse, Jonathan quietly stepped away, unnoticed by most, leaving behind a lesson louder than any speech, louder than any sermon, louder than any applause. He didn't need recognition. His role had already been fulfilled. What mattered was the transformation he had catalyzed, in Kenneth, in the audience, and in everyone who would carry the story forward. Social media would later buzz with clips, comments, and reactions, but the true lesson couldn't be captured on video. It was felt in the hearts of those present, experienced in the quiet understanding that strength and respect, when practiced genuinely, could move mountains, calm storms, and transform lives. People would share it, yes, but the real impact would be personal, internal, and enduring. Kenneth turned once more to the emptying hall, reflecting on the day. He had come into the service with confidence, accustomed to being the center of attention. He left with something greater: awareness, humility, gratitude, and the knowledge that leadership and influence are not measured by loudness or dominance, but by how we treat others and how we rise to guide when circumstances demand faith, patience, and calm. Today, he said softly, almost to himself, I was reminded that true power is silent, true respect is earned, and true transformation begins when we act not for recognition, but for purpose, faith, and humility. And as he walked out with Jonathan beside him, past the lingering faces, past the hushed whispers, past the echoes of awe and gratitude, one message remained clear: the most powerful lessons are often quiet, the most lasting changes are often unseen, and the greatest strength lies in humility, faith, and respect. Type faith in the comments if you believe humility and quiet strength are real power. Share this story and let everyone know. True transformation doesn't always make a spectacle. Sometimes, it simply changes hearts, silently, forever.